Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All story recordings are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story was first published January 1, 1955. Tal Howard has returns home from a Korean prisoner of war camp. He can't help feeling that something's missing. Desperate for a thrill as much as a big payday, Tal heads for the sleepy village in upstate New York where a dying pal once assured him buried treasure awaits. If Tal can find the girl who can lead him to it, another stranger is in town, Earl Fitzmartin, a cold, mysterious loner who terrorized him and the other POWs. Now this psychopath is watching Tal's every move and waiting to strike. A Bullet for Cinderella Part 1. A Bullet for Cinderella. Chapter 1. A steady April rain was soaking the earth. It hadn't been bad to drive through until dusk came. In the half-light it was hard to see the road. The rain was heavy enough to reflect my headlights back against the windshield. My mileage on the speedometer told me I couldn't be very far from Hillston. When I saw the motel sign ahead on the right, I slowed down. It looked fairly new. I turned in. The parking area was paved with those round brown pebbles that crunch under the tires. I parked as close to the office as I could get and ran from the car into the office. A woman with the bright cold eyes and thin sharp movements of a water bird rented me a room far back from the highway sound. She said the place was just 4 miles from the Hillston city limits. Once I saw the room I decided that it would do. It would be a good place to stay while I did what had to be done in Hillston. I stretched out on the bed and wondered if I had been smart to use my right name on the motel register. But if I could find the money, there would be no one to say that I was the one who had taken it. And using my right name wouldn't make any difference at all. When at last the rain eased up, I went and found a small roadside restaurant. The girl behind the counter told me where I could buy a bottle of liquor. She seemed open to any invitation to help me drink it up, but though she was reasonably pretty, I was not interested. I had this other thing on my mind, and I wanted to go back alone and have some drinks and think about it and wonder how I could do it. Maybe you saw pictures of us, the ones who were really bad off when the prisoners were exchanged. I was one of the litter cases. My stomach had stopped digesting the slop they fed us, and I was down to 93 pounds. One more week and I would have been buried up there beyond the river like so many others were. I was in bad shape. Not only physically but mentally. I was too sick to be flown back. Memory was all shot. I went right into hospital and they started feeding me through a tube. It was during the months in the military hospital back in this country that I began to sort things out and began to remember more of the details about Timmy Warden of Hillston. When the intelligence people had interrogated me, I had told them how Timmy died, but nothing more than that. I didn't tell them any of the stuff Timmy had told me. We were both captured at the same time in that action near the reservoir. I'd known him casually. He was in a different platoon. We were together most of the time after we were captured. Enough has already been written about how it was. It wasn't good. That prison camp experience can change your attitude toward life and toward yourself. It did that to Timmy Warden. His one thought was to survive. It was that way with all of us, but Timmy seemed more of a fanatic than anybody else. He had to get back. He told me about it one night. That was after he'd gotten pretty weak. I was still in fair shape. He told me about it in the dark, whispering to me. I couldn't see his face. Tal, I've got to get back and straighten something out. I've got to. Every time I think about it, I'm ashamed. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was getting what I wanted. Maybe I've grown up now. I've got to get it straightened out. What was it you wanted? I wanted it and I got it, but I can't use it now. I wanted her too, and had her, but she's no good to me now. I'm not following this so good, Timmy. He told me the story then. He had been in business with his brother George Warden. George was older by 6 years. George took him in as a partner. George had a flair for salesmanship and promotion. Timmy was good on the books, as he had a natural knack for figure work. They had a building supply business, a retail hardware outlet, a lumberyard, and several concrete trucks. And George had a lush, petulant, immoral, discontented young wife named Eloise. I didn't make any play for her, Tal. It just seemed to happen. She was my brother's wife and I knew it was bad, but I couldn't stop. We had to sneak around behind his back. Hillston isn't a very big city. We had to be very careful. I guess I knew all the time what she was. But George thought she was the best thing that ever walked. She was the one who talked me into running away with her, Tal. She was the one who said we'd have to have money. So I started to steal. He told me how he did it. A lot of the gimmicks didn't make much sense to me. He did all the ordering, handled the bank accounts and deposits. It was a big and profitable operation. He took a little bit here, a little bit there, always in cash. All the time he was doing it he was carrying on the affair with Eloise. He said it took nearly 2 years to squirrel away almost $60,000. The auditors didn't catch it. I couldn't open a bank account with the money, and I knew better than to put it in a safety deposit box. I put the money in those old-fashioned jars. The kind with the red rubber washer and the wire that clamps the top on. I'd fill them and bury them. George kept worrying about why we weren't making more money. I kept lying to him. Eloise was getting more restless all the time and more careless. I was afraid George would find out, and I didn't know what he'd do. She had me sort of hypnotized. We finally set the date when we were going to run away. Everything was planned. And then they called me up. I was reserved. There wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. I told Eloise that when I got out we'd go through with it the way we planned. But now I'm stuck here. And now I don't want to go through with it. I want to get back there and give the money back to George and tell him the whole thing. I've had too much chance to think it over. How do you know she hasn't taken the money and left? I didn't tell her where I put it. It's still there. Nobody can find it. His story gave me a lot to think about. Timmy Warden sank lower and lower. By that time those of us who were left alive had become expert on how long the dying would last. And I knew that Timmy was one of the dying. I knew he'd never leave there alive. I tried to find out where the money was buried. But I'd waited a little too long. He was out of his head. I listened to him rave. I listened to every word he said. But in his raving he never gave away the hiding place. It was in a moment of relative lucidity that he told me. It was afternoon and he caught my wrist with his wasted hand. I'm not going to make it, Tal. You'll make it. No. You go back there and straighten it out. You can do that. Tell George. Give him the money. Tell him everything. Sure. Where is the money? Tell him everything. Where's the money hidden? Cindy would know, he said, suddenly breathless with weak, crazy laughter. Cindy would know. And that's all I could get out of him. I was still strong enough then to use a shovel. I helped dig the hole for Timmy Warden that night. Back in the stateside hospital I thought about that $60,000. I could see those fruit jars with the tight rolls of bills inside the glass. I would dig them out and rub the dirt off and see the green gleam of the money. It helped pass the time in the hospital. Finally they let me out. The thought of the money was no longer on the surface of my mind. It was hidden down underneath. I would think about it, but not very often. I went back to my job. It seemed pretty tasteless to me. I felt restless and out of place. I'd used up a lot of emotional energy in order to stay alive and come back to this, back to my job and back to Charlotte, the girl I had planned to marry. Now that I was back neither job nor girl seemed enough. 2 weeks ago they let me go. I don't blame them. I'd been doing my job in a listless way. I told Charlotte I was going away for a while. Her tears left me completely untouched. She was just a girl crying, a stranger. I told her I didn't know where I was going. But I knew I was going to Hillston. The money was there. And somebody named Cindy who would know how to find it. I had started the long trip with an entirely unrealistic anticipation of success. Now I was not so confident. It seemed that I was searching for more than the $60,000. It seemed to me that I was looking for some meaning or significance to my life. I had $1,000 in traveler's checks and everything I owned with me. Everything I owned filled 2 suitcases. Charlotte had wept, and it hadn't touched me. I had accepted being fired without any special interest. Ever since the repatriation, since the hospital, I had felt like half a man. It was as though the other half of me had been buried and I was coming to look for it, here in Hillston, a small city I had never seen. Somehow I had to begin to live again. I had stopped living in a prison camp, and never come completely to life again. I drank in the motel room until my lips felt numb. There was a payphone in the motel office. The bird woman looked at me with obvious disapproval but condescended to change 3 ones into change for the phone. I had forgotten the time difference. Charlotte was having dinner with her people. Her mother answered the phone. I heard the coldness in her mother's voice. She called Charlotte. Tal? Tal, where are you? A place called Hillston. Are you all right? You sound so strange. I'm okay. What are you doing? Are you looking for a job? Not yet. She lowered her voice so I could barely hear her. Do you want me to come there? I would, you know, if you want me. And no, no strings, Tal darling. No. I just called so you'd know I'm all right. Thank you for calling, darling. Well, goodbye. Please write to me. I promised and hung up and went back to my room. I wanted things to be the way they had once been between us. I did not want to hurt her. I did not want to hurt myself. But I felt as if a whole area in my mind was dead and numb. The part where she had once been. She had been loyal while I had been gone. She was the one who had the faith I would return. She did not deserve this. On the following morning, Thursday morning, Hillston lay clean and washed by the night rains, bright and glowing in the April sunshine. Timmy had often talked about the city. It's more town than city. There isn't much of a transient population. Everybody seems to know everybody. It's a pretty good place, Tal. It lay amid gentle hills, and the town stretched north-south, following the line of Hart's River. I drove up the main street, Delaware Street. Traffic had outgrown the narrowness of the street. Standardization had given most of our small cities the same look. Plastic and glass brick storefronts. Woolworths and J.C. Penney and Liggett and Timely and the chain grocery. The essential character of Hillston had been watered down by this standardization, and yet there was more individuality left than in many other cities. Here was a flavor of leisure, of mild manners and quiet pleasures. No major highway touched the city. It was in an eddy apart from the great current. Doubtless there were many who complain acidly about the town being dead on its feet, about the young people leaving for greater opportunities. But such human irritants did not change the rather smug complacency of the city. The population was 25,000 and Timmy had told me that it had not changed very much in the past 20 years. There was the pipe mill and a small electronics industry and a plant that made cheap hand tools. But the money in town was the result of its being a shopping center for all the surrounding farmland. I had crossed the country as fast as I could, taking it out on the car, anxious to get to this place. The car kept stalling as I stopped for the lights on Delaware Street. When I spotted a repair garage I turned in. A man came up to me as I got out of the car. I think I need a tune-up. It keeps stalling. And a grease job and oil change. He looked at the wall clock. About 3 this afternoon be okay? That'll be all right. California plates. On your way through? Just on a vacation. I stopped here because I used to know a fellow from this town. Timmy Warden. He was a gaunt man with prematurely white hair and bad teeth. He picked a cigarette out of the top pocket of his coveralls. Knew Timmy, did you? The way you say it, I guess you know he's dead. Yes. I was with him when he died. They're in the camp, eh? Guess it was pretty rough. It was rough. He used to talk about this place. And about his brother George. I thought I'd stop and maybe see his brother and tell him about how it was with Timmy. The man spat on the garage floor. I guess George knows how it was. I don't understand. There's another man came here from that camp. Matter of fact he's still here. Came here a year ago. Name of Fitzmartin. Earl Fitzmartin. He works for George at the lumberyard. Guess you'd know him, wouldn't you? I know him, I said. Everybody who survived the camp we were in would know Fitzmartin. He'd been taken later, had come in a month after we did. He was a lean man with tremendously powerful hands and arms. He had pale colorless hair, eyes the elusive shade of wood smoke. He was a Texan and a Marine. I knew him. One cold night 6 of us had solemnly pledged that if we were ever liberated we would one day hunt down Fitzmartin and kill him. We had believed then that we would. I had forgotten all about it. It all came back. Fitz was not a progressive. Yet he was a disrupting influence. In the camp we felt that if we could maintain a united front it would improve our chances for survival. We organized ourselves, appointed committees, assigned responsibilities. There were 2 retreads who had been in Jap camps in another war who knew the best organizational procedures. Fitz, huskier and quicker and craftier than anyone else in camp, refused to take any part in it. He was a loner. He had an animal instinct for survival. He kept himself clean and fit. He ate anything that was organically sound. He prowled by himself and treated us with icy contempt and amusement. He was no closer to us than to his captors. He was one of the 12 quartered in the same hut with Timmy and me. Perhaps that does not seem to constitute enough cause to swear to kill a man. It wouldn't, in a normal situation. But in captivity minor resentments become of major importance. Fitz wasn't with us so he was against us. We needed him and every day he proved he didn't need us. At the time of the exchange Fitzmartin was perhaps 20 pounds lighter. But he was in good shape. Many had died but Fitz was in fine shape. I knew him. I'd like to see him, I told the garage man. Is the lumberyard far from here? It was north of town. I had to take a bus that crossed a bridge at the north end of town and walk a half-mile on the shoulder of the highway, past junkyards, a cheap driving movie, run-down rental cabins. I kept asking myself why Fitz should have come to Hillston. He couldn't know about the money. But I could remember the slyness of the man, his knack of moving without a sound. The lumberyard was large. There was an office near the road. There was a long shed open on the front where semi-fabricated pieces were kept in bins in covered storage. I heard the whine of a saw. Beyond the 2 buildings were tall stacks of lumber. A truck was being loaded back there. In the open shed a clerk was helping a customer select window frames. An office girl with thin face and dark hair looked up from an adding machine and told me I could find Fitzmartin out in the back where they were loading the truck. I went back and saw him before he saw me. He was heavier but otherwise unchanged. He stood with another man watching 2 men loading a state truck. He wore khakis and stood with his fists in his hip pockets. The man said something and Earl Fitzmartin laughed. The sound startled me. I had never heard him laugh in the camp. He turned as I approached him. His face changed. The smoke eyes looked at me, wary, speculative. I've got the name right, haven't I? Tal Howard. That's right. There was, of course, no move toward shaking hands. He turned to the other man. Joe, you go right ahead here. Leave this slip in the office on your way out. Fitzmartin started walking back through the lot between the stacked lumber. I hesitated and followed him. He led the way to a shed on the back corner of the lot. An elderly Ford coupe was parked by the shed. He opened the door and gestured and I went into the shed. It was spotlessly clean. There was a bunk, table, chair, shelf with hot plate and dishes. He had a supply of canned goods, clean clothes hanging on hooks, a pile of magazines and paper-bound books near the head of the bunk. There was a large space heater in the corner, and through an open door I could see into a small bathroom with unfinished walls. There was no invitation to sit down. We faced each other. Nice to see any old pal from north of the river, he said. I heard in town you work here. You just happened to be in town and heard I work here. That's right. Maybe you're going around looking all the boys up. Maybe you're writing a book. It's an idea. My experiences as a prisoner of war. Me and Dean. I'd put you in the book, Fitz. The big ego. Too damn impressed with himself to try to help anybody else. Help those gutless wonders? You typed stone me. You wanted to turn it into a boys' club. I watched a lot of you die because you didn't have the guts or will or imagination to survive. With your help maybe a couple more would have come back. You sound like you think that would be a good thing. There was an amused sneer in his tone that brought it all vividly back. That was what we had sensed about him. He hadn't cared if we had all been buried there, just so Fitzmartin got out of it with a whole skin. I had thought my anger and outrage had been buried, had thought I was beyond caring. Perhaps he, too, misjudged the extent of the contempt that made me careless of his physical power. I struck blindly, taking him almost completely by surprise, my right fist hitting his jaw solidly. The impact jarred my arm and shoulder and back. It knocked him back a full step. I wanted him on the floor. I swung again and hit a thick, hard arm. He muffled the third blow and caught my left wrist, then grabbed my right wrist. I tried to snap my wrists free, but he was far too powerful. I was able to resist the grinding, twisting force for several seconds. His face was quite impassive. I was slowly forced down onto my knees, tears of anger and humiliation stinging my eyes. He released my wrists suddenly and gave me a casual open-handed slap across the side of my head that knocked me down onto the bare floor. I scrambled to the chair and tried to pick it up to use it as a weapon. He twisted it out of my hands, put a foot against my chest and shoved me back so that I rolled toward the door. He put the chair back in place, went over and sat on the bunk, and lighted a cigarette. I got up slowly. He looked at me calmly. Out of your system? God damn you. He looked bored. Shut up. Sit down. Don't try to be the boy hero, Howard. I'll mark you up some if that's what you want. I sat in the chair. My knees were weak and my wrists hurt. He got up quickly, went to the door and opened it and looked out, closed it and went back to the bunk. We'll talk about Timmy Warden, Howard. What about Timmy? It's too damn late for games. Information keeps you alive. I did a lot of listening in that camp. I made a business of it. I know that Timmy stole $60,000 from his brother and stashed it away in jars. I know Timmy told you that. I heard him tell you. So don't waste our time trying to play dumb about it. I'm here and you're here, and that's the only way it adds up. I got here first. I got here while you were still in the hospital. I haven't got the money. If I had it, I wouldn't still be here. That's obvious. I figured Timmy might have told you where he hid it. I've been waiting for you. What kept you? I don't know any more about it than you do. I know he hid it, but I don't know where. He was silent as he thought it over. Maybe I won't buy that. I came here on a long shot. I didn't have much to go on. I wanted to be here and all set when you came after it. It was a long shot, but one town is the same as another to me. I can't see you coming here to find the money and not knowing any more than I do. You're a more conservative type, Howard. You know something I want to know. That's right, I said. I know exactly where it is. I can go and dig it up right now. That's why I waited a year before I came here. And that's why I came here to see you instead of going and digging it up. Why come at all? I shrugged. I lost my job. I remembered the money. I thought I'd come here and look around. I've spent a year looking around. I know a hell of a lot more about Timmy Warden, the way he lived, the way his mind worked, than you'll ever know. And I can't find it. Then I won't be able to either, will I? Then you better take off, Howard. Go back where you came from. I think I'll stay around. He leaned forward. Then you do have some little clue that I don't have. Maybe it isn't a very good one. I don't know any more than you do. I just have more confidence in myself than I have in you. That made him laugh. The laughter stung my pride. It was a ludicrous thought to him that I could do anything in the world he couldn't do. You've wasted better than a year on it. At least I haven't done that, I said hotly. He shrugged. I have to be somewhere. It might as well be here. What's wasted about it? I've got a good job. Let's pool everything we know and can remember, and if we can locate it I'll give you a third. No, I said, too quickly. He sat very still and watched me. You have something to work on. No, I don't. You can end up with nothing instead of a third. Or all of it instead of a third. Finding it and taking it away from here are two different problems. I'll take that chance. He shrugged. Well, suit yourself. Go and say hello to George. Give him my regards. And Eloise? You won't be able to do that. She took off while we were still behind the wire. Took off with a salesman, they say. Maybe she took the money with her. I don't think so. But she knew Timmy was hiding it, had hidden a big amount. From what he said about her, she wouldn't leave without it. She did, he said, smiling. Take my word. She left without it. Chapter 2. The lumberyard had looked reasonably prosperous. The retail hardware store was not what I expected. From talks with Timmy I had expected a big place with 5 or 6 clerks and a stock that ranged from appliances and cocktail trays to deep well pumps and pipe wrenches. It was a narrow, dingy store, poorly lighted. There was an air of dust and defeat about it. It was on a side street off the less prosperous-looking end of Delaware Street. A clerk in a soiled shirt came to help me. I said I wanted to see Mr. Warden. The clerk pointed back toward a small office in the rear where through glass I could see a man hunched over a desk. He looked up as I walked back to the office. The door was open. I could see the resemblance to Timmy. But Timmy, just before and for a short time after we were taken, had a look of bouncing vitality, good spirits. This man looked far older than the 6 years difference Timmy had told me about. He was a big man, as Timmy had been. The wide, high forehead was the same, and the slightly beaked nose and the strong, square jaw. But George Warden looked as though he had been sick for a long time. His color was bad. The stubble on the unshaven jaw was gray. His eyes were vague and troubled, and there was a raw smell of whiskey in the small office. "Something I can do for you?" "My name is Tal Howard, Mr. Warden. I was a friend of Timmy's." "You were a friend of Timmy's?" He repeated it in an odd way, apathetic and yet somehow cynical. "I was with him when he died." "So was Fitz." "Sit down, Mr. Howard. Drink?" I said I would have a drink. He pushed by my chair and went out to a sink. I heard him rinsing out a glass. He came back and picked a bottle off the floor in the corner and put a generous drink in each glass. "Here's to Timmy," he said. "To Timmy. Fitz got out of it. You got out of it. But Timmy didn't make it." "I almost didn't make it." "What did he actually die of?" Fitz couldn't say. I shrugged. "It's hard to tell. We didn't have medical care. He lost a lot of weight and his resistance was down. He had a bad cold. He ran a fever and his legs got swollen. He began to have trouble breathing. It hurt him to breathe. A lot of them went like that. Nothing specific. Just a lot of things. There wasn't much you could do." He turned the dirty glass around and around. "He should have come back. He would have known what to do." "About what?" "I guess he told you about how we were doing before he left. He said you had a pretty good business. This store used to be over on Delaware. We moved about 6 months ago. Sold the lease. Sold my house too. Still got the yard and this. The rest of it is gone." I felt uncomfortable. "Business is bad, I guess." "It's pretty good for some people. What business are you in?" "I'm not working right now." He smiled at me in a mirthless way. "And I suppose you plan on sticking around a while." I'd thought of it. "Did Fitz send for you?" "I don't know what you mean. I didn't know he was here." "But you talked to him. He phoned me and said you'd probably be in for a little chat. And that you're an old friend of Timmy's. He's been working for me for nearly a year. I don't see how I can give you a job. There just isn't enough coming in. I couldn't swing it." "I don't want a job, Mr. Warden." He kept smiling. His eyes were funny. I had the feeling that he was either very drunk or out of his head. "Maybe something nice out of the store? We still have some nice things. I could unlock the gun rack for you. Need a nice over and under, with gold inlay, French walnut stock? On the house." "No thanks. I don't understand, Mr. Warden. I knew Timmy and I thought maybe it would be the right thing to do to just stop in and chat." "Sure. But you went out to the yard first." "Yes. I went out there because I put my car in a garage here and I told the man I'd known Timmy in prison camp. He said there was another man here who'd been in the same place, Earl Fitzmartin. So I went out there and saw him. Then I came here. I could have come here first and then gone out there. I don't know why you think you have to give me a job or a gun or anything." He looked at me and then bent over and picked up the bottle again. He put some in both glasses. "Okay," he said. "So it's just like that. Pay no attention to me. Hardly anybody does anymore. Except Fitz. He's a good worker. The yard makes a little money. That's a good thing, isn't it?" "Yes, I guess it is." It wasn't anything like the conversation I had expected. He was a strange man. He seemed defeated and yet amused, as though amused at his own defeat. "Timmy talked a lot about Hillston," I said. "I guess he did. He lived here most of his life." Though I didn't feel right about it, I took the plunge. We had a lot of time to talk. They made us go to lectures and read propaganda and write reports on what we read, but the rest of the time we talked. I feel as though I know Hillston pretty well. Even know the girls he used to go with. Ruth Stan. Janice Courier. Cindy somebody. "Sure," he said softly, half smiling. "Ruthie Stan. And it was Judith, not Janice Courier. Those were 2 of them. Nice girls." But the last couple of years before he went away he stopped running around so much. Stuck closer to the business. Lots of nights he'd work on the books. He was getting almost too serious to suit me. Wasn't there one named Cindy? He frowned and thought and shook his head. No Cindy I know of. Either of those other two would have made him a good wife. Ruthie is still around town, still single. Judy got married and moved away. El Paso, I think. Either one of them would have made him a better wife than the one I got stuck with. Eloise. He talk about her? He mentioned her a few times. She's gone. I know. Fitz told me. Lovely little Eloise. Two-faced bitch. While you're around, stop in again any time. We'll have a nice little chat. I'm usually here. Hell, I used to have a lot of other things to do. Zoning board. Chamber of Commerce. Rotary. Always on the run. Always busy. Now I have a lot of time. All the time in the world. I was dismissed. I walked back through the narrow store to the street door. The clerk leaned against one of the counters near the front, picking his teeth with a match. It felt good to get back out into the sunlight. The cheap liquor had left a bad taste in my mouth. It was too early to go after the car. I went into the nearest bar I could find and ordered an ale. It was a dark place, full of brown and violet shadows, with deer antlers on the wall and some dusty mounted fish. Two elderly men played checkers at a corner table. The bartender was a dwarf. The floor was built up behind the bar to bring him up to the right height. I sipped the ale and thought about Fitz, about my own unexpectedly violent reaction that had been made ludicrous by his superior strength. I had not thought that I cared enough. It was a long time since camp. But he had brought it all back. The time with him had not been pure fiasco, however. I sensed that I had won a very small victory in the talk that had followed the one-sided fight. He was not certain of where I stood, how much I knew. The talk with George had cancelled that small victory. George puzzled me. There was a curious undercurrent in his relationship with Fitz, something I could not understand. Bartenders are good sources of information. I sensed that the little man was watching me, trying to figure out who I was. I signaled for a refill. When he brought my glass back from the beer tap I said, "What do people do for excitement around this town?" He had a high, thin voice. "Stranger in town, are you? It's pretty quiet. Saturday night there's things going on here and there. Not much on a weekday. There's some that drive all the way to Reading. There's gambling there, but it's crooked. Then it's easier to meet women there than here. You a salesman?" I needed a quick answer and I suddenly remembered something that Fitz had said to give me my gimmick, ready-made, and reasonably plausible. "I'm working on a book." He showed a quick interest. "Writer, are you? What's there here to write about? Historical stuff?" "No. It's a different kind of a book. I was taken prisoner in Korea. Some of the boys died there, boys I knew. This book is a sort of personal history of those boys. You know, the way they lived, what they did, what they would have come back to if they'd lived. One of them is from this town. Timmy Warden." "Hell, did you know Timmy? My God, that was a shame. There was a good kid. I've been talking to his brother, George, just down the street." The little man clucked and shook his head. "George has just plain gone to hell the last year or so. He and Timmy had a pretty good setup too. Couple of good businesses. But then George's wife left him. Then he got word Timmy was dead. It took the heart out of him, I guess. He's got about 1/10 the business he used to have, and he won't have that long if he keeps hitting the bottle. Buckstam's girl has been trying to straighten him out, but she's wasting her time. But that Ruthie is stubborn. I tell you, if Timmy had made it back and if he'd waited until now, he'd have a long uphill fight. George has been selling stuff off and piddling away the money he gets. Lives in a room at White's Hotel. Gets drunk enough to be picked up every now and then. For a while there they'd just take him home because he used to be an important man in this town. Now they let him sober up in the can." One of the old men playing checkers said, "Stump, you talk too damn much." "Watch your game," Stump said. "Get some kings. Let smart people talk in peace, Willie." He turned back to me and said, "How do you figure on writing up Timmy?" "Oh, just the way he lived. Where he was born. Interview his school teachers. Talk to the girls he dated." Stump glanced at the checker players and then hunched himself over the bar and spoke in a tone so low they couldn't hear him. Stump wore a sly smirk as he talked. "Now I wouldn't stand back of this, and it isn't anything you could put in your book, but I heard it from a pretty good source that before Timmy took off into the army, he and that Eloise Warden were a little better than just plain friends. Know what I mean? She was a good-looking piece, and you can hardly blame the kid, if she was right there asking for it. She was no good, anyway. She took off with a salesman and nobody's seen or heard from her since. He backed away and gave me a conspiratorial smile. Of course, George wouldn't know anything about it. Like they say, he'd be the last to know. Are there any other relatives in town, beside George? Not a one. Their daddy died 6 or 7 years ago. George got married right after that. Then the 3 of them, George, Timmy, and Eloise, stayed right on in the old Warden place. George sold it this year. Man named Sila bought it. He chopped it up into apartments, I hear. I talked with him for another half hour, but he didn't have very much to add. He asked me to stop around again. I liked the atmosphere of his bar, but I didn't like him. He was a little too eager to prove he knew everything, particularly the unsavory details. When I got back to the garage a little after 3, my car was ready. I paid for the work. It ran smoothly on the way back to the motel south of town. Once I was in my room with the door shut, I reviewed everything that had happened. Though I had told my lie about writing up Timmy on impulse, I couldn't see how it could hurt anything. In fact, it might make things a good deal easier. I decided that I'd better buy some kind of pocket notebook and write things down so that my story would stand up a little better. There was no reason why Timmy and the others like him shouldn't be written up. I remembered that a magazine had done the same sort of thing with the progressives who refused repatriation. So why not the dead? They would be more interesting than the turncoats, who, almost without exception, fell into 2 groups. They were either ignorant and very nearly feeble-minded, or they were neurotic, out of balance, with a lifelong feeling of having been rejected. The dead were more interesting. My one abortive attempt to find Cindy had failed. Using the cover story of writing up Timmy, I should be able to find her. From what Timmy had said, she was a girl who would know of a special hiding place. And the money was there. Unless Eloise had taken it. I was puzzled by Fitz's insistence that she hadn't taken it. When I went back into town for dinner, I bought a notebook in a drugstore. At dinner I filled 3 pages with notes. I could have filled more. Timmy had talked a lot. There hadn't been much else to do. I went to a movie, but I couldn't keep my mind on it. The next person to talk to was Ruth Stan. I could see her the next morning. But back in the motel room I took another look at Ruth Stan. I took her picture out of the back of my wallet. Tomorrow, Friday, I would see her for the first time in the flesh. I had looked at this picture 1,000 times. Timmy had showed it to me in camp. I remember the day we sat with our backs against a wall in watery sunshine and he took the picture out and showed it to me. That's the one, Tal. I didn't have sense enough to stay with her. That's the good one, Tal. Ruthie Stan. They had taken my papers away from me, including the shots of Charlotte. I held the picture of Ruthie Stan, turning it toward the pale sunshine. It was cracked, but none of the cracks touched her face. It was in color and the colors had faded and changed. She sat on her heels and scratched the joyous belly of a blonde cocker while she laughed up into the camera eye. She wore yellow shorts and a halter top, and her laughter was fresh and good and shared. In some crazy way it became our picture, Timmy's and mine. I took it off his body after he died and it became mine. It represented an alien world of sanity and kindness and strength. I looked at it often. Now I took it out again and lay on the motel bed and looked at it in the lamplight, and felt a tingle of anticipation. For the first time I permitted myself to wonder if this pilgrimage to Hillston was in part due to the picture of a girl I had never seen, and to wonder if this picture had something to do with the death of love for Charlotte. I put the picture away. It took a long time to get to sleep, but the sleep that came was deep and good. Chapter 3. On Friday morning it was not until I opened the bureau drawer to take out a clean shirt that I knew somebody had been in the room. I had stacked the clean shirts neatly in one corner of the big middle drawer. They were scattered all over the drawer as if stirred by a hasty hand. I went over all my things and saw more and more evidence of quick, careless search. There was nothing for anyone to find. I had written down nothing about the elusive Cindy. It did not seem probable that the maid or the woman who had rented me the room had done this. Nor did it seem probable that it had occurred on the previous day while I was out. I checked the door. I distinctly remembered locking it. It was unlocked. That meant someone had come in while I had slept. Fortunately, from long habit, I had put my wallet inside the pillowcase. My money was safe. Some cool morning air came through the door, chilling my face and chest, and I realized I was sweating lightly. I remembered how Fitz could move so quietly at night. I did not like the thought of his being in the room, being able to unlock the door. I did not see how it could have been anyone else. I wondered how he had found the motel so easily. I had given the address to no one. Yet it could not have taken too long on the phone. Maybe an hour or an hour and a half to find where I was registered. It would take patience. But Fitzmartin had waited over a year. I had breakfast, looked up an address and drove off to see the girl of the cracked, treasured picture, the girl who, unknown to herself, had eased great loneliness, and strengthened frail courage. Dr. Buxton was a veterinary. His home and place of business was just east of town, a pleasant old frame house with the animal hospital close by. Dogs made a vast clamor when I drove up. They were in individual runways beside the kennels. There were horses in a corral beyond the house. Dr. Stam came out into the waiting room when the bell on the door rang. He was an enormous man with bushy red hair that was turning grey. He had a heavy baritone voice and an impressive frown. "We're not open around here yet unless it's an emergency, young man." "No emergency. I wanted to see your daughter for a minute." "What about?" "It's a personal matter. I was a friend of Timmy Warden." He did not look pleased. "I guess I can't stop you from seeing her. She's at the house, wasting time over coffee. Go on up there. Tell her Al hasn't showed up yet and I need help with the feeding. Tell her Butch died in the night and she'll have to phone the Bronsons. Got that?" "I can remember it." "And don't keep her too long. I need help down here. Go around to the back door. She's in the kitchen." I went across the lawn to the house and up the back steps. It was a warm morning and the door was open. The screens weren't on yet. The girl came to the back door. She was medium tall. Her hair was dark red, a red like you can see in old furniture made of cherry wood, oiled and polished so the sun glints fire streaks in it. She wore dungarees and a pale blue blouse. Her eyes were tilted grey, her mouth a bit heavy and quite wide. She had good golden skin tones instead of the blotched pasty white of most redheads. Her figure was lovely. She was 26, or perhaps 27. There are many women in the world as attractive as Ruth Stam. But the expression they wear for the world betrays them. Their faces are arrogant, or petulant, or sensuous. That is all right because their desirability makes up for it, and you know they will be good for a little time, and when you have grown accustomed to the beauty, there will be just the arrogance or the petulance left. But Ruth wore her own face for the world, wore an expression of strength and humility and goodness. Should you become accustomed to her loveliness, there would still be all that left. This was a for keeps girl. She couldn't be any other way because all the usual poses and artifices were left out of her. This was a girl you could hurt, a girl who would demand and deserve utter loyalty. "I guess I'm staring," I said. She smiled. "You certainly are." She tried to make smile and words casual, but in those few moments, as it happens so very rarely, a sharp awareness had been born, an intense and personal curiosity. I took the picture out of my pocket and handed it to her. She looked at it and then looked sharply at me, eyes narrowed. "Where did you get this?" "Timmy Warden had it." "Timmy? I didn't know he had this. Were you at that place? In the camp with him?" "Yes." "Wait a minute. Your father gave me some messages for you. He says Al hasn't showed up and he needs help with the feeding. And you're to phone the Bronsons that Butch died during the night." Her face showed immediate concern. "That's too bad." "Who was Butch?" "A nice big red setter. Some kid in a jalopy hit him, and didn't even stop. I should phone right away." "I would like to talk to you when you have more time. Could I take you to lunch today?" "What do you want to talk to me about?" The lie was useful again. "I'm doing a book on the ones who didn't come back. I thought you might help fill me in on Timmy. He mentioned you many times. We used to go together." Yes, I'll help all I can. Can you pick me up at 12:15 here?" "I'll be glad to." "And, may I have the picture back?" She hesitated and then handed it to me. "The girl in this picture was 18. That's a long time ago," she frowned. "You didn't tell me your name yet." "Howard. Tal Howard." Our glances met for a few seconds. Again there was that strong awareness and interest. I believe it startled her as much as it did me. The figure in the picture was a girl. This was a woman, a fulfillment of all the promises in the picture, a mature and lovely woman, and we were shyly awkward with each other. She said goodbye and went into the house. I drove back into town. For a long time I had carried the picture in the photograph in my mind. Now reality was superimposed on that faded picture. I had imagined that I had idealized the photo image, given it qualities it did not possess. Now at last I knew that the reality was stronger, more persuasive than the dreaming. I found the old Warden house and chatted for a time with the amiable Mr. Seiler who had purchased it from George Warden. It was a big, high-shouldered frame house and he had cut it into 4 apartments. Mr. Seiler needed no encouragement to talk. In fact, it was difficult to get away from him. He complained of the condition of the inside of the house when he took it over. That George Warden lived here alone for a while and that man must have lived like a darn bear. In addition he complained about the yard. When I took it over I didn't expect much grass. But the whole darn place had been spaded up like somebody was going to plant every inch of it and then just left it alone. That was a clue to some of Fitzmartin's activities. He was a man who would do a good job of searching. And the isolation of the house behind high plantings would give him an uninterrupted opportunity to dig. I drove back out through April warmth and picked up Ruth's Stam at the time she suggested. She had changed to a white sweater and a dark green skirt. She seemed more reserved, as if she had begun to doubt the wisdom of coming along with me. As we got into the car I said, "How did the Bronsons take it?" "Very hard. I thought they would. But I talked them into getting another dog right away. That's the best way. Not the same breed, but a new pup, young enough to need and demand attention." "Where should we have lunch? Where we can talk?" "The coffee shop at the Hillston Inn is nice." I remembered seeing it. I was able to park almost in front. She led the way back through a bleak lobby and down a half flight of stairs to the coffee shop. It had big dark oak booths upholstered in red quilted plastic. They were doing a good business. The girls were brisk, starched. There was a good smell of steaks and chops. She accepted the offer of a drink before lunch, and said she'd like an old-fashioned, so I ordered 2 of them. There was an exceptionally fresh, clean look about her. She handled herself casually and well. "How well did you know Timmy?" she asked me. "Pretty well. In a deal like that you get to know people well. Whatever they are, it shows. You knew him well, too, I guess." We went steady. It started 7 years ago. Somehow it seems like longer than 7 years. We were seniors in high school when it started. He'd been going with a friend of mine, Judy Courier. They had a sort of spat and they were mad at each other. I was mad at the boy I'd been going with. When he wanted to take me out I went. And we went together from then on. When we graduated we both went up to State College at Reading. He only went 2 years and then came back to help George. When he quit, I quit, too. We came back here and everybody thought we were going to get married. She smiled a small wry smile. I guess I did, too. But then things changed. I guess he lost interest. He worked very hard. We drifted apart. Were you in love with him? She gave me a slightly startled glance. I thought I was, of course. Otherwise we wouldn't have been as close. But, I don't know as I can explain it. You see, Timmy was very popular in high school. He was a good athlete, and everybody liked him. He was president of the senior class. I was popular, too. I was queen of the senior pageant and all that sort of thing. We both liked to dance and we were good at it. It was as if people expected us to go together. It seemed right to other people. And that sort of infected us, I guess. Maybe we fell in love with the way we looked together, and felt the responsibility of what other people wanted us to be. We made a good team. Do you understand that? Of course. When it finally ended it didn't hurt as badly as I would have thought it would. If it hadn't ended, we would have gone on and gotten married and, I guess it would have been all right. She looked puzzled. What kind of a guy was he, Ruth? I told you. Popular and nice and underneath. I don't want to feel disloyal or anything. Another drink? No. We better order, thanks. After we had given the order, she frowned beyond me and said, there was something weak about Timmy. Things had come too easily. His mind was good and his body was good and he made friends without trying. He'd never been, tested. I had the feeling that he thought that things would always be that easy all his life. That he could always get whatever he wanted. It worried me because I'd learned the world isn't like that. It was as though nothing had ever happened to him to make him grow up. And I used to wonder what would happen when things started to go wrong. I knew he'd either turn into a man, or he'd start to whine and complain. He turned into a man, Ruth. There was a sudden look of tears in her eyes. I'm glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that. I wish he'd come back. I think you would have seen that I'm right. After he stopped going with you, who did he go with before he went into the army? Her eyes were evasive. No one. I lowered my voice. He told me about Eloise. Her face became more pale. So it was true, then. I couldn't be completely certain. But I suspected it. It made me sick to think that could be going on. And it was part of the pattern. Everything came so easily. I don't think he even realized what he was doing to himself and to George. She was trash. Everybody was sorry and shocked when George married her. Timmy told me about Eloise and he told me he was sorry about it. He wanted to come back so he could make things right. I guess he knew he couldn't turn the clock back and make things like they were before, but he wanted to be able to make amends of some sort. I don't think George has ever suspected. But even if he knew now, it couldn't hurt too much. He knows what she is now. What was she like? Quite pretty in a sort of full-blown way. A tawny blonde, with a kind of gypsy-looking face. I don't know where she got those features. They're not like the other people in her family. She was a year ahead of me in school at first, and then in the same year, and then a year behind me. She never did graduate from high school. She was dumb as a post as far as schoolwork is concerned. But smart in other ways. Very smart. She was sloppy. You know, soiled collars, bare dirty ankles. She always soaked herself in perfume. She had a very sexy walk, full hips and a tiny waist and nice legs. She had a lot of little provocative mannerisms. Boys used to follow her around like stupid dogs, their eyes glazed and their tongues out. We used to make fun of her, but we hated her, and in some funny way we were jealous of her. She did as she pleased. She always seemed to be mocking everybody. It was a very good marriage for her, to marry George. Then the three of them were living in that house. I guess she got bored. Being right there in the house, once she got bored, Timmy had as much chance as hamburger in a panther cage. I guess they were careful, but in a place this size people get to know things. Quite a few people were talking by the time Timmy went away. I hadn't had a date with Timmy for over 2 years when he went away. Then Eloise went off with a salesman. That was so stupid of her. She had everything she wanted. George believed in her. The man's name was Fulton. He was a big red-faced man who drove a grey Studebaker and came to Hillston about once every 6 months. Eloise ran off almost. No, it's over 2 years ago. George had to be out of town on business. People saw Eloise and Mr. Fulton right here in this place having dinner one night, bold as can be. They must have left that night. When George came back they were gone. Did he try to trace her? He didn't want to. He was too badly hurt. She'd packed her prettiest things, and taken the house money and gone without even leaving a note. I'll bet that someday she's going to come crawling back here. Would George take her back? I don't know. I don't know what he'd do. I've been trying to help George. She blushed. Dad always teases me about the way I keep bringing kittens and homeless dogs back to the place. He says my wards eat up all the profits. It's sort of the same with George. He hasn't got anyone now. Not a soul. Not anyone in the world. He's drinking all the time and he's lost most of his business. I do what little I can. Cook for him sometimes. Get his room cleaned up. Get his clothes in shape. But I can't seem to make him wake up. He just keeps going down and down. It makes me sick. I saw him at the store. He wasn't in very good shape. He acted strange. The store is doing almost no business at all. The lumberyard looks all right. I was out there to talk to Fitzmartin. He was in the same camp. I know. He told me that. Is he a good friend of yours? No. I don't like him, Tal. He's a strange man. I don't know why George hired him. It's almost as if he had some hold over George. And I have the feeling he keeps pushing George downhill. I don't know how, or why he should. He kept bothering me. He kept coming to see me to talk about Timmy. It seemed very strange. What did he want to talk about? It didn't make much sense. He wanted to know where Timmy and I used to go on picnics when we were in high school. He wanted to know if we ever went on hikes together. And he acted so sly about it, so sort of insinuating that the last time he came it made me mad and I told him I wouldn't talk to him anymore. It seemed like such a queer thing for him to keep doing. He's creepy, you know. His eyes are so strange and colorless. Has he stayed away? Oh yes. I got very positive about it. He had such an unhealthy kind of interest in Timmy. I wondered if it was the same sort of thing with you. But if you're going to write about him, I can understand you're wanting to know things. The honesty in her level eyes made me feel ashamed. There was an awkward pause in our conversation. She fiddled with her coffee spoon and then, not looking up, said, "Timmy told you about Eloise. Did he tell you about me?" She was blushing again. "He mentioned you. He didn't say much. I could make something up to make you feel better, but I don't want to do that." She raised her head to look directly at me, still blushing. "This isn't anything to go in your book. But it's nothing I'm ashamed of. And maybe you can understand him better, or me better, if I tell you. We went steady during our senior year here. A lot of the kids, a lot of our friends, who went steady, taking it for granted that they were going to get married as soon as they could, they slept together. It was almost taken for granted. But Timmy and I didn't. Then we both went up to Reading. We were both away from home. We were lonely and in a new environment. It just happened. It got pretty intense for a few months, but we began to realize that it wasn't helping anything. We stopped. Oh, we had a few lapses, accidents. Times it wasn't meant to happen. But we stopped, and felt very proud of our character and so on. You know, I sometimes wonder if that is what spoiled things for us. It's a pretty Victorian attitude to think that way, but you can't help wondering sometimes. I felt ill at ease with her. I had never come across this particular brand of honesty. She had freely given me an uncomfortable truth about herself, and I felt bound to reciprocate. I said, too quickly, "I know what you mean. I know what it is to feel guilty from the man's point of view." When they tapped my shoulder, I had 30 days grace before I had to report. I had a girl, Charlotte, and a pretty good job. We wondered if we ought to get married before I left. We didn't. But I took advantage of all the corny melodrama. Man going to the wars and so on. I twisted it so she believed it was actually her duty to take full care of the departing warrior. It was a pretty frantic 30 days. So off I went. Smug about the whole thing. What soft words hadn't been able to accomplish, the North Koreans had done. She's a good kid. But you're back and you're not married? No. I came back in pretty bad shape. My digestive system isn't back to par yet. I spent quite a while in an army hospital. I got out and went back to my job. I couldn't enjoy it. I used to enjoy it. I couldn't do well at it. And Charlotte seemed like a stranger. At least I had enough integrity not to go back to bed with her. She was willing, in the hopes it would cure the mopes. I was listless and restless. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. Finally they got tired of the way I was goofing off and fired me. So I left. I started this project. I feel guilty as hell about Charlotte. She was loyal all the time I was gone. She thought marriage would be automatic when I got back. She doesn't understand all this. And neither do I. I only know that I feel guilty and I still feel restless. What is she like, Tal? Charlotte? She's dark-haired. Quite pretty. Very nice eyes. She's a tiny girl, just over 5 feet and maybe 100 pounds sopping wet. She'd make a good wife. She's quick and clean and capable. She has pretty good taste, and her daddy has yay bucks stashed. Maybe you shouldn't feel guilty. I frowned at her. What do you mean, Ruth? You said she seems like a stranger. Maybe she is a stranger, Tal. Maybe the you who went away would be a stranger to you, too. You said Timmy changed. You could have changed, too. You could have grown up in ways you don't realize. Maybe the Charlotte who was ample for that other Tal Howard just isn't enough of a challenge to this one. So I break her heart. Maybe better to break her heart this way than marry her and break it slowly and more thoroughly. I can explain better by talking about Timmy and me. I don't understand. When Timmy lost interest, the blow was less than I thought it would be. I didn't know why. Now after all this time I know why. Timmy was a less complicated person than I am. His interests were narrower. He lived more on a physical level than I do. Things stir me. I'm more imaginative than he was. Just as you are more imaginative than he was. Suppose I'd married him. It would have been fine for a time. But inevitably I would have begun to feel stifled. Now don't get the idea that I'm sort of a female long hair. But I do like books and I do like good talk and I do like all manner of things. And Timmy, with his beer and bowling and sports page attitude, wouldn't have been able to share. So I would have begun to feel like sticking pins in him. Do you understand? Maybe not. I'm the beer, bowling, and sports page type myself. She watched me gravely. Are you, Tal? It was an uncomfortable question. I remembered the first few weeks back with Charlotte when I tried to fit back into the pattern of the life I had known before. Our friends had seemed vapid, and their conversation had bored me. Charlotte, with her endless yak about building lots, and what color draperies, and television epics, and aren't these darling shoes for only $4.95, and what color do you like me best in, and yellow kitchens always look so cheerful. Charlotte had bored me, too. My Charlotte, curled like a kitten against me in the drive-in movie, wide-eyed and entranced at the monster images on the screen who traded platitudes, had bored me. I began to sense where it had started. It had started in the camp. Boredom was the enemy, and all my traditional defenses against boredom had withered too rapidly. The improvised game of checkers was but another form of boredom. I was used to being with a certain type of man. He had amused and entertained me and I him. But in the camp he became empty. He with his talk of sexual exploits, boyhood victories, and gargantuan drunks, he had made me weary just to listen. The flight from boredom had stretched my mind. I spent more and more time in the company of the offbeat characters, the ones who before capture would have made me feel queer and uncomfortable, the ones I would have made fun of behind their backs. There was a frail headquarters type with a mind stuffed full of things I had never heard of. They seemed like nonsense at first and soon became magical. There was a corporal, muscled like a Tarzan, who argued with a mighty ferocity with the young, intense, mustachioed Marine private about the philosophy and ethics of art, while I sat and listened and felt unknown doors open in my mind. Ruth's quiet question gave me the first valid clue to my own discontent. Could I shrink myself back to my previous dimensions, I could once again fit into the world of Job and Charlotte and blue draperies and a yellow kitchen and the Saturday night mixed poker game with our crowd. If I could not shrink myself, I would never fit there again. And I did not wish to shrink. I wished to stay what I had become, because many odd things had become meaningful to me. Are you, Tal? She asked again. Maybe not as much as I thought I was. You're hunting for something, she said. The strange truth of that statement jolted me. You're trying to do a book. That's just an indication of restlessness. You're hunting for what you should be, or for what you really are. She grinned suddenly, a wide grin, and I saw that one white tooth was entrancingly crooked. Dad says I try to be a world mother. Pay no attention to me. I'm always diagnosing and prescribing and meddling. She looked at her watch. Wow. He'll be stomping and thundering. I've got to go right now. I paid the check and we went out to the car. On the way back I steered the conversation to the point where I could say, and I remember him talking about a girl named Cindy. Who was she? Ruth frowned. Cindy? I can remember some. No, there wasn't any girl named Cindy in this town, not that Timmy would go out with. I'm sure he never knew a pretty one. And for Timmy a girl had to be pretty. Are you certain that's the right name? I'm positive of it. But what did he say about her? He just mentioned her casually a few times, but in a way that sounded as though he knew her pretty well. I can't remember exactly what he said, but I got the impression he knew her quite well. It defeats me, Ruth said. I turned into the driveway and stopped in front of the animal hospital and got out as she did. We had been at ease and now we were awkward again. I wanted to find some way of seeing her again, and I didn't know exactly how to go about it. I hoped her air of restraint was because she was hoping I would find a way. There had been too many little signs and hints of a surprising and unexpected closeness between us. She could not help but be aware of it. I want to thank you, Ruth, I said and put my hand out. She put her hand in mine, warm and firm, and her eyes met mine and slid away, and I thought she flushed a bit. I could not be certain. I'm glad to help you, Tal. You could let me know if you think of more questions. The opening was there, but it was too easy. I felt a compulsion to let her know how I felt. I'd like to be with you again even if it's not about the book. She pulled her hand away gently and faced me squarely, chin up. I think I'd like that, too. She grinned again. See? A complete lack of traditional female technique. I like that. I like it that way. We better not start sounding too intense, Tal. Intense? I don't know. I carried your picture a long time. It meant something. Now there's a transition. You mean something. Do you say things like that just so you can listen to yourself saying them? Not this time. Call me, she said. She whirled and was gone. Just before she went in the door I remembered what I meant to ask her. I called to her and she stopped and I went up to her. Who should I talk to next about Timmy? She looked slightly disappointed. Oh, try Mr. Leach, head of the math department at the high school. He took quite an interest in Timmy. And he's a nice guy. Very sweet. I drove back into town, full of the look of her, full of the impact of her. It was an impact that made the day, the trees, the city, all look more vivid. Her face was special and clear in my mind, the wide mouth, the one crooked tooth, the grey slant of her eyes. Her figure was good, shoulders just a bit too wide, hips just a shade too narrow to be classic. Her legs were long, with clean lines. Her flat back and the inswept lines of her waist were lovely. Her breasts were high and wide-spaced, with a flavor of impertinence, almost arrogance. It was the coloring of her though that pleased me most. Dark red of the hair, gray of the eyes, golden skin tones. It was nearly 3 when I left her place. I tried to put her out of my mind and think of the interview with Leach. Leach might be the link with Cindy. I must have been a half-mile from the stamp place when I began to wonder if the Ford coupe behind me was the one I had seen beside Fitz's shed. I made 2 turns at random and it stayed behind me. There was no attempt at the traditional nuances of shadowing someone. He tagged along, 100 feet behind me. I pulled over onto the shoulder and got out. I saw that it was Fitz in the car. He pulled beyond me and got out, too. I marched up to him and said, "What the hell was the idea of going through my room?" He leaned on his car. "You have a nice gentle snore, Howard." Soothing. I could tell the police. "Sure. Tell them all." He squinted in the afternoon sunlight. He looked lazy and amused. "What good does it do you to follow me?" "I don't know yet. Have a nice lunch with Ruthie? She's a nice little item. All the proper equipment. She didn't go for me at all. Maybe she likes the more helpless type. Maybe if you work it right you'll get a chance to take her to." He stopped abruptly, and his face changed. He looked beyond me. I turned just in time to see a dark blue sedan approaching at a high rate of speed. It sped by us and I caught a glimpse of a heavy balding man with a hard face behind the wheel, alone in the car. The car had out-of-state plates but it was gone before I could read the state. I turned back to Fitz. "There's no point in following me around. I told you I don't know anymore." I stopped because there was no point in going on. He looked as though I had become invisible and inaudible. He brushed by me and got into his car and drove on. I watched it recede down the road. I got into my own car. The episode made no sense to me. I shrugged it off my mind and began to think about Leach again. Chapter 4. Though the high school kids had gone, the doors were unlocked and a janitor, sweeping green compound down the dark red tiles of the corridor, told me I could probably find Mr. Leach in his office on the ground floor of the old building. The 2 buildings, new and old, were connected. Fire doors separated the frame building from the steel and concrete one. My steps echoed in the empty corridor with a metallic ring. A demure little girl came out of a classroom and closed the door behind her. She had a heavy armload of books. She looked as shy and gentle and timid as a puppy in a strange yard. She looked at me quickly and hurried on down the corridor ahead of me, moccasin soles slapping, meager horsetail bobbing, shoulders hunched. I found the right door and tapped on it. A tired voice told me to come in. Leach was a smallish man with a harsh face, jet eyebrows, a grey brush cut. He sat at a table marking papers. His desk, behind him, was stacked with books and more papers. "Something I can do for you?" "My name is Tal Howard. I want to talk to you about a student you used to have." He shook hands without enthusiasm. "An ex-student who is in trouble?" "No. I'm refreshed. Not in trouble? Fancy that. The faculty has many callers. Federal narcotics people. Parole people. prison officials, county police, lawyers. Sometimes it seems that we turn out nothing but criminals of all dimensions. I interrupted you. I don't want to impose on you. I can see how busy you are. I'm gathering material about Timmy Warden. Ruth Stam suggested I talk to you. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. Timmy Warden. Gathering material. That has the sound of a book. Was he allowed to live long enough to give you enough material? Timmy and some others. They all died there in the camp. I was there, too. I almost died, but not quite. Sit down. I'm perfectly willing to talk about him. I take it you're not a professional. No, sir. Then this, as a labor of love, should be treated with all respect. Ruth knows as much about Timmy as any person alive, I should say. She told me a lot. And I got a lot from Timmy. But I need more. She said you were interested in him. I was. Mr. Howard, you have probably heard of cretins who can multiply two 5-digit numbers mentally and give the answer almost instantaneously. Yes, but... I know. Timmy was no cretin. He was a very normal young man. Almost abnormally normal if you sense what I mean. Yet he had a spark. Creative mathematics. He could sense the rhythm behind numbers. He devised unique shortcuts in the solution of traditional class problems. He had that rare talent, the ability to grasp intricate relationships and see them in pure simple form. But there was no drive, no dedication. Without dedication, Mr. Howard, such ability is merely facility, an empty cleverness. I hope to be a mathematician. I teach mathematics in a high school. Merely because I did not have enough of what Timmy Warden was born with. I hoped that one day he would acquire the dedication. But he never had time. I guess he didn't. Even if he had the time, I doubt if he would have gone any further. He was a very good, decent young man. Everything was too easy for him. It wasn't easy at the end. I don't imagine it was. Nor easy for hundreds of millions of his contemporaries anywhere in the world. This is a bad century, Mr. Howard. Bad for the young. Bad for most of us. What do you think would have become of him if he'd lived, Mr. Leach? The man shrugged. Nothing exceptional. Marriage, work, children. And death. No contribution. His name gone as if it never existed. One of the faceless ones. Like us, Mr. Howard. He rubbed his eyes again, then smiled wanly. I'm not usually so depressing, Mr. Howard. This has been a bad week. This is one of the weeks that add to my conviction that something is eating our young. This week the children have seemed more sullen, dangerous, dispirited, inane, vicious, foolish, and impossible than usual. This week a young sophomore in one of my classes went into the hospital with septicemia as the result of a self-inflicted abortion. And a rather pleasant boy was slashed. And last Monday 2 seniors died in a head-on collision while on their way back from Reading, full of liquor. The man in the other car is not expected to recover. When Timmy was here in school I was crying doom. But it was not like it is now. By comparison, those were the good old days, recent as they are. Was Timmy a disciplinary problem? No. He was lazy. Sometimes he created disturbances. On the whole he was cooperative. I used to hope Ruth would be the one to wake him up. She's a solid person. Too good for him, perhaps. I guess he was pretty popular with the girls. Very. As with nearly everything else, things were too easy for him. He mentioned some of them in camp. Judy, Ruth, Cindy. I couldn't be expected to identify them. If I remember correctly, I once had 8 Judys in one class. Now that name, thank God, is beginning to die out a little. There have never been too many Cindys. Yet there has been a small, constant supply. I want to have a chance to talk to the girls he mentioned. I've talked to Ruth. Judy has moved away. I can't remember Cindy's last name. I wonder if there is any way I could get a look at the list of students in hopes of identifying her. I guess you could, he said. The administration office will be empty by now. You could ask them Monday. Let me see. Timmy graduated in 46. I keep old yearbooks here. They're over there on that bottom shelf. You could take the ones for that year and the next 2 years and look them over. They're by the window if you like. I have to get on with these papers. And I really can't tell you much more about Timmy. I liked him and had hopes for him. But he lacked motivation. That seems to be the trouble with too many of the children lately. No motivation. They see no goal worth working for. They no longer have any dreams. They are content with the manufactured dreams of N, B, C, and Columbia. I sat by the windows and went through the yearbooks. There was no Cindy in the yearbook for 46. There was one in the 47 yearbook. I knew when I saw her picture that she could not be the one. She was a great fat girl with small, pinched, discontented features, sullen, rebellious little eyes. There was a Cindy in the 48 yearbook. She had a narrow face, protruding teeth, weak eyes behind heavy lenses, an expression of overwhelming stupidity. Yet I marked down their names. It would be worth a try, I thought. I went back to the 46 yearbook and went through page after page of graduates more thoroughly. I came to a girl named Cynthia Cooper. She was a reasonably attractive snub-nosed blonde. I wondered if Timmy could possibly have said Cynthia. It would be an awkward nickname for Cynthia. And even though his voice by that time had been weak and blurred, I was certain he had said Cindy. He had repeated the name. But I wrote her down, too. Ruth Stam's yearbook picture was not very good. But the promise of her, the clear hint of what she would become, was there in her face. Her activities, listed under the picture, made a long list. It was the same with Timmy. He grinned into the camera. Mr. Leach looked up at me when I stood near his table. Any luck? I took down some names. They might help. I thanked him for his help. He was bent over his papers again before I got to the door. Odd little guy, with his own strange brand of dedication and concern. Pompous little man, but with an undercurrent of kindness. I got to the Hillston Inn at a little after 5. I got some dimes from the cashier and went over to where 4 phone booths stood flanked against the lobby wall. I looked up the last name of the fat girl, Cindy Waskowitz. There were 2 Waskowitzes in the book, John W. and P. C. I tried John first. A woman with a nasal voice answered the phone. I'm trying to locate a girl named Cindy Waskowitz who graduated from Hillston High in 1947. Is this her home? Hold it a minute, the woman said. I could hear her talking to someone else in the room. I couldn't make out what she was saying. She came back on the line. You want to know about Cindy? That's right. Please. This wasn't her home. But I can tell you about her. I'm her aunt. You want to know about her? Please. It was the glands. I couldn't remember the word. My daughter just told me. The glands. When she got out from high school she weighed 200. From there she went up like balloons. 200, 250, 300. When she died in the hospital she was nearly 400. She'd been over 400 once, just before she went in the hospital. Glands, it was. I remembered the rebellious eyes. Girl trapped inside the prison of white, soft flesh. A dancing girl, a lithe, quick-moving girl forever lost inside that slow inevitable encroachment. Stilled finally, and buried inside her suet prison. Is your daughter about the same age Cindy would have been? A year older. She's married and 3 kids already. The woman chuckled warmly. Could I talk to your daughter? Sure. Just a minute. The daughter's voice was colder, edged with thin suspicion. What goes on anyhow? Why do you want to know about Cindy? I was wondering if she was ever friendly in high school with a boy named Timmy Warden. Timmy is dead. It was in the papers. I know that. Were they friendly? Timmy and Cindy? Geez, that's a tasty combination. He would have known who she was on account of her being such a tub. But I don't think he ever spoke to her. Why should he? He had all the glamour items hanging around his neck. Why are you asking all this? I was in the camp with him. Before he died he gave me a message to deliver to a girl named Cindy. I wondered if Cindy was the one. Not a chance. Sorry. You just got the wrong one. Was there another Cindy in the class? In one of the lower classes. A funny-looking one. That's the only one I can remember. All teeth. Glasses. A sandy sort of girl. I can't remember her last name, though. Cindy Kushner. That's the name. Gosh, I don't know where you'd find her. I think I saw her downtown once a year ago. Maybe it's in the book. But I don't think she'd fit any better than my cousin. I mean Timmy Warden ran around with his own group, kind of. Big shots in the school. That Kushner wasn't in that class, any more than my cousin. Or me. The bitterness was implicit in her tone. I thanked her again. She hung up. I tried Kirshner. There was only one in the book. Ralph J. A woman answered the phone. I'm trying to locate a Cindy Kirshner who graduated from Hillston High in 1948. That's my daughter. Who is this calling, please? Could you tell me how I could locate her? She married, but she doesn't have a phone. They have to use the one at the corner store. She doesn't like to have people call her there because it's a nuisance to the people at the store. And she has small children she doesn't like to leave to go down there and answer the phone. If you want to see her, you could go out there. It's 1610 Blackman Street. It's near the corner of Butternut. A little blue house. Her name is Mrs. Rorick now. Mrs. Pat Rorick. What did you say your name is? I repeated the directions and said, thanks very much, Mrs. Kirshner. I appreciate your help. Goodbye. I hung up. I was tempted to try Cynthia Cooper, but decided I had better take one at a time, eliminate one before starting the next. I stepped out of the booth. Earl Fitzmartin stepped out of the adjoining booth. He smiled at me almost genially. So it's got something to do with somebody named Cindy. I don't know what you're talking about. I was in camp with Timmy. Before he died he gave me a message to deliver to a girl named Cindy. So you try 2 Cindys in a row. And you know when they graduated. Busy, aren't you? Go to hell, Fitz. He stood with his big hard fists on his hips, rocking back and forth from heel to toe, smiling placidly at me. You're busy, Tal. Nice little lunch with Ruth. Trip to the high school. Tracking down Cindy. Does she know where the loot is? He was wearing a dark suit, well cut. It looked expensive. His shoes were shined, his shirt crisp. I wished I'd been more alert. It's no great trick to stand in one phone booth and listen to the conversation in the adjoining one. I hadn't even thought of secrecy, of making certain I couldn't be overheard. Now he had almost as much as I did. How did you get along with George, Howard? I got along fine. Strange guy, isn't he? He's a little odd. And he's damn near broke. That's a shame, isn't it? It's too bad. The Stam girl comes around and holds his hand. Maybe it makes him feel better. Poor guy. You know he even had to sell the cabin. Did Timmy ever talk about the cabin? Thank you for listening to today's story. I really hoped you enjoyed it as much I did. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.